There's been a lot of talk lately about fake news and false information. Well, one place you can go to make sure you get real information and learn real history and economics is Liberty Classroom. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to learn more. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Kevin Gutzman about the 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine. Dr. Gutzman is the chairman of the Department of History at Western Connecticut State University and the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. He is also the author of James Madison and the Making of America. He has a law degree from the University of Texas at Austin and a PhD in U.S. history from the University of Virginia. He hosts the Constitution Hour on the Veritas Radio Network. You can follow his work at kevingutzman.com. That's Kevin, Gutzman.com. You can also find him at libertyclassroom.com, where he is a faculty member, and at veritasradionetwork.com. You can find him on Facebook under Kevin Gutzman and on Twitter at Kevin Gutzman. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/incorporation-doctrine. Kevin, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here.
Well, great. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's start out with some definitions. What is the 14th Amendment and what is the Incorporation Doctrine?
Well, first, the 14th Amendment is one of three of what are called the Civil War amendments. It was adopted in the conclusion of the Civil War, and it had several different purposes. So if you were to go online and Google 14th Amendment and find the text of it online, which you can easily do, and then read it, first thing you'd notice is, wow, this is just a hodgepodge of different stuff. These things are really unrelated. It has 5 sections. The first section is about guaranteeing basic rights to newly freed slaves. So it starts by saying that any person who's born in the United States is a citizen of the United States and of the state in which he resides. And what this did was to repeal or to correct the holding in Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857 that a black person, even if free, could not be a citizen of the United States. Okay, so there's that. Then there also, still in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, is the guarantee that, is the statement that no state may deprive any person of the equal protection of the laws. There's a statement in Section 1 that every state must grant to every person that it may not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So this is the most litigated part of the entire Constitution. The next 3 sections concern the questions of voting rights for former Confederates, state and Confederate debt of the Confederate states, the apportionment of the U.S. House of Representatives as the formerly enslaved people in the South are now being recognized as full citizens. And finally, Section 5 says that the Congress will have authority to pass laws that are necessary to implement the first 4 sections. So again, you can see that they're obviously all products of problems that existed at the time of the end of the Civil War and the freeing of the slaves, but they're not obviously the kinds of matters you would expect to find in a single amendment. I think virtually any legal scholar would say, well, yeah, I could do a better job drafting than that. You'd have 2 or 3 amendments, and they would each have a discrete subject, and probably you'd use language that was less vague. So that, I think, is a kind of rough description of the 14th Amendment.
Okay, so then what is the Incorporation Doctrine, and what is its connection to the 14th Amendment?
Well, beginning in the second decade of the 20th century, federal courts have said that various of the individual rights formerly understood as having been under the ambit of state governments were actually rights that could be enforced by the federal government against state governments under the rubric of the Due Process Clause of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. The Due Process Clause is the portion of Section 1 that says nor shall any person be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So you might have thought that being deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law meant being executed, jailed, or fined without having an adversarial hearing. And actually, that seems to be what it actually meant when it was adopted. But beginning in the second decade of the 20th century, courts said, well, this means that state government can't adopt a law that deprives you of freedom of speech or the freedom of press or the right to dance in the nude or the right to burn a flag or the right to marry somebody of the same sex or just all kinds of things that clearly have nothing at all to do with the text of the 14th Amendment or with the intention of the people who adopted the 14th Amendment. It's become a kind of all-purpose, open reservoir of judicial authority to tell state governments what to do. And this is why I was able to predict more than 20 years ago that ultimately we'd have a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court defining marriage for us. Well, defining marriage is not something that anybody would have thought that the 14th Amendment should do when it was adopted, but federal courts have found that they can claim that the 14th Amendment gives them power to do that kind of thing and that there's really no check in the federal system on their doing so. So if Anthony Kennedy, one of the Supreme Court justices involved in the recent sex cases, for example, if he wants to say, well, the 14th Amendment due process clause means that I can impose my philosophical views on Idaho or California or New York, he's free to do that, and nobody can stop him, as long as he can get 5 votes.
Well, and didn't John Sherman, then a senator from Ohio, have some interesting things to say about the 14th Amendment and what situations it could be applied to?
Well, John Sherman said during the ratification process in Ohio that Ohioans should recognize that the 14th Amendment wasn't going to have any effect in Ohio. And how could he say that? The reason he could say that is because, as the Supreme Court recognized in the first case involving interpretation of the 14th Amendment that came before it, slaughterhouse cases, this amendment was supposed to be about the rights of black people. And the court said, we can't imagine a case involving the 14th Amendment that isn't about the rights of black people. Everybody knows that the rights of black people are what the 14th Amendment was supposed to protect. So you white butchers from Louisiana, whatever we think of your policy problem with the government of Louisiana, go away. This is not something that we're going to get involved in, and you certainly can't shoehorn it into the 14th Amendment. But, of course, John Sherman's promise to his constituents that they could ratify the 14th Amendment, sanguine in the assurance that it would only be a problem for people who lived in, Kentucky and Alabama, has turned out to be a false promise, or at least it's not been borne out by succeeding experience. I think, though, that really what the Incorporation Doctrine shows us is that people who wrote the U.S. Constitution were right to be skeptical of office holders. Essentially, James Madison thought in Federalist 51 that people who hold political office will basically exercise whatever power they can, and so you have to think, okay, what power might this language leave open to them to exercise? Because if they find there's something that they can do and there's nobody to stop them, they're going to do it. And here we have the 14th Amendment basically just badly drafted, and then we have a kind of sea change in elite intellectual culture in America that says it's okay for experts to, quote-unquote experts, although, a lawyer isn't really expert in any of these things, but quote-unquote experts to be imposing their will on people regardless of the outcomes of elections or the content of state constitutions, then Supreme Court justices are going to do that. And not only do they do that, but then they get all kinds of awards and they're lionized by media figures and so on, and there's just every incentive for them to act that way unless they actually take seriously the idea that they should uphold their oaths of office, which apparently most of them don't. So it's a problem.
Yeah, so I want to return to the subject of the slaughterhouse cases, and I also want to bring up Barron v. Baltimore and ask you about what Barron v. Baltimore and what the slaughterhouse cases said about the way the Bill of Rights was understood prior to the Incorporation Doctrine and the way the Constitution was understood prior to the Incorporation Doctrine beginning to be used.
Well, Barron versus Baltimore is the only significant case in which Chief Justice John Marshall held against federal authority. So what had happened there was that Baltimore, the chief port on Chesapeake Bay, had a problem that when they had heavy rainfall, which was pretty common in Baltimore, the rains would kind of wash out streets in the town, and so they decided to regrade a lot of the roads. And what this led to was more manageable runoff when there was rainfall. But this fellow Barron owned a pier in the port of Baltimore, and after they regraded the roads, the silt built up around his pier, and so it became unusable. And therefore he decided, well, this is the city of Baltimore's fault, and perhaps thinking, it's unlikely that the courts of Baltimore are going to compensate me for this, he went into federal court and asked that under the Fifth Amendment takings clause, which says that nor shall any property be taken for public use without just compensation, he ought to be given just compensation. Faced with this argument, Chief Justice Marshall in the unanimous court said, well, okay, it's true that you seem to have been deprived of your property by the action of the city of Baltimore, but the city of Baltimore is part of the state of Maryland, and the Fifth Amendment takings clause was not supposed to be enforceable against the state. It was intended to limit the federal government and reserve power to the state. So if you have a problem with the state of the city of Baltimore, the state of Maryland, you need to take that up with your elected officials or your judiciary in Baltimore, not with us. Case dismissed. In fact, Marshall also said, and he was prone to dicta, wide-ranging dicta, but he said in his opinion in Barron versus Baltimore that this principle generally was true of the entire Bill of Rights. None of it was enforceable against state governments. The whole point of it was to reassure people that there wasn't excessive power being granted to the federal government, and so it was a limitation only on the federal government, not on the state governments. In Slaughterhouse, the court said that this is the way that the Constitution had been understood, that if the court agreed with the plaintiffs in the slaughterhouse cases, it would erect itself into a kind of super censor of all state and local laws, and it would become the supervisory body of the entire American political system. And this is not the way a republic is supposed to work. It's not the way our Constitution is supposed to work. We don't want that kind of a role, and so we're not going to do this. Now, of course, we have the completely opposite view, and it's, I think, if not unanimously held in American law schools, I'm sure more than 80% of American law professors think that, well, yeah, basically in the end, these kinds of questions should be decided by some court, some judge, some panel of people who've gone to Harvard and Yale law schools. They should make this decision, not you peons. And actually there have been several attempts by people at prominent law schools in the last couple of decades to explain how this is actually Republican. This is actually Democratic. In some cases, you might think taking power away from the elected legislature and exercising it yourself, even though you've never been elected and aren't accountable to anybody, was the definition of undemocratic. But this sophistry holds that it's actually more democratic than the legislature. So, in short, the decisions upending Barron versus Baltimore and slaughterhouse cases have meant that in recent decades, virtually every portion of the Bill of Rights has been held to be enforceable by federal governments against state government. And notice, this is actually impossible. They say that they're enforcing the principles of the federal Bill of Rights against state governments, but you can't do that. You can't enforce For example, the principle that all questions of the relationship between government and religion are to be decided at the state level, you can't enforce that against the state government. How would you enforce that against the state government? So what federal courts have really done under the rubric of the Establishment Clause is just say, the Establishment Clause means the federal government is supposed to be completely out of the religion business, and the state government has to be too. So right there in John Sherman's state of Ohio, for example, one small town was made to remove the very little cross in its city seal, which was over 150 years old, because supposedly the Incorporation Doctrine meant that the principle of the Establishment Clause was now enforceable against the city. And that it's just nonsense. We also know that it was not intended by the people who adopted the 14th Amendment, because in the decade immediately after the Civil War, beginning during Reconstruction, there was a serious attempt made in Congress to add an amendment to the Constitution making the principle of separation of church and state enforceable against state governments. It actually got more than majority support in the U.S. House of Representatives, never got that much support in the Senate. And, of course, that wasn't enough anyway, because it takes 2/3 of each house to recommend an amendment to the states. But the interesting thing about that whole campaign is nobody ever said, well, we don't need this amendment because we've already got the 14th Amendment. We already have the Incorporation Doctrine. We've already made this principle enforceable against the states. Nobody said that because it wasn't true. When they hadn't begun to make this ridiculous argument, they wouldn't yet for another 4 decades.
Friends, if you want to gain a deeper understanding of history, economics, political theory, the sorts of topics we cover on this show, then check out Liberty Classroom, featuring a wide variety of courses, including some that are taught by professors who have been guests on this show, such as Kevin Gutzman, Jason Jewell, and G.P. Manish. Liberty Classroom will provide you with videos, audio files, question and answer sessions, discussion forums, and all of the resources you need to become a better debater and have a deeper knowledge of American history, world history, economics, political theory, and more. Learn real history and economics right at your computer or on the go and be able to more confidently and clearly articulate your views. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to learn the information necessary to become a master debater for a mere 24 cents a day. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to find out more about Liberty Classroom and to help support the Wake Up Call podcast. So what were some of the early cases that brought about the Incorporation Doctrine, and what have we seen be incorporated so far?
Oh boy, well, in the 19-teens, several cases involving anarchists and speech, press during World War I and so on, public criticism of the government's war policy, and there was one famous case in which that people said, well, we should be siding with the Russian communists, and I don't like the president's policy in regard to the war and that kind of thing, and of course, the funny thing about that is during wartime, the court decided, well, these principles may be generally enforceable, but during wartime we're going to give you a pass on them anyway. We're going to go ahead and punish people for criticizing the war policy. Yet they also staked out the claim that these principles, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and so on, would be enforceable against state governments by federal court when peacetime came around. In recent decades, basically, any time you hear about a controversial case being decided by a federal court, unless it has to do with Obamacare, it's going to be related to the Incorporation Doctrine. So in recent decades, we've had, for example, quote-unquote speech cases that said that burning a flag was speech, and that speech was protected by the Incorporation Doctrine against state infringement. If I said in my class next Monday morning, well, I'm going to give a speech, and then I lit the drapes on fire, nobody would think I was actually speaking. But in judge speak, speech includes burning. Of course, this is just a fatuous assertion. There has also been a Supreme Court case finding that Indiana could not, a particular little town in Indiana could not ban public nude dancing, because nude dancing fell under the speech clause too. And your listeners may be kind of flummoxed to try to figure out how shaking one's bare breasts has anything to do with, I don't know, pondering philosophical truths or making some kind of political argument. But the court said, well, this is speech, and under the Incorporation Doctrine, speaking is protected against state infringement, and therefore we're going to hold that Indiana has to allow this kind of establishment. And there have been cases that involved limitation on on state government's powers to decide what punishments people would receive for particular crimes. One of my feeling, maybe the most infamous of these, was a case called Kennedy versus Louisiana a few years ago, in which Justice Kennedy actually said, well, Louisiana can't prescribe capital punishment for raping a very small child because under the Eighth Amendment, which is incorporated into the Due Process Clause and thus enforceable against state governments by the federal courts, we have decided to follow the evolving standards of decency of a developing society, and we think that raping a small child is not an important enough crime to merit the death penalty. Which leads to the question, well, what is an important crime? My own feeling is nothing is worse than raping a small child. If somebody wanted to, if some wrongdoer had a choice between raping a small child and killing me, I would say killing me would be a less terrible thing to do. But these guys on the Supreme Court, they never were elected. They don't have to account to anybody, and so they can just make idiotic statements like that, and that becomes the law on the ground of this ridiculous Incorporation Doctrine. There was a case in the 1960s, Gideon versus Wainwright, in which the Supreme Court said, under the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment, which was incorporated into under the Eighth Amendment, that a fellow had to be provided free counsel in a criminal case. So this was an idea unknown till then. There just essentially any individual rights assertion that somebody makes against a state government is almost certainly going to be, if it's heard in federal court, it's going to be decided under the rubric of this Incorporation Doctrine.
Now, you've obviously outlined some pretty egregious examples of the Incorporation Doctrine being applied, and also explains that the federal power grab and the added influence that federal courts take on would be a reason to oppose the Incorporation Doctrine, seeing as they've been able to fit pretty much anything they want to into this notion. But proponents of the Incorporation Doctrine might argue that one of the benefits of it is that there would be a federal protection against potential actions by local and state governments that are unsavory. So why is that argument flawed? What's wrong with that, and what examples might they point to back up their claims?
Well, the ultimate issue in politics is who decides. Who decides? So in the American system, as the people intended it, at least, not as the courts have inverted it, the decision was we would have little government, and when we did have government, in general, decision-making would be localized through the principle of federalism. It would be retained at the state level, and then, in general, policy-making would be by elected legislators, so that they would be responsible to the people. In other words, liberty would be favored both in the sense that we were going to have little government when we could, and then it would be local, so that people in Idaho wouldn't be deciding, what kind of lunch meats were going to be in lunches little kids were eating in school in North Carolina, where most people in Idaho have never been and have no intention to go, and people in Maine wouldn't be making decisions for people in Kansas. But under the kind of perversion of the federal Constitution that we've had for over the last century, and which has just grown worse over time, still getting worse. We've had essentially the abandonment of these principles of federalism, republicanism, and limited government. And so when it comes to republicanism, we see that the increasingly centralized system features a large swath of areas in which policy decisions are made by people who have never been elected and aren't accountable to anybody. If an elected legislator had said, well, we're going to get rid of harsh punishment for raping little kids because I don't think it's that bad a thing to do, he would have been voted out at the next election. But Anthony Kennedy and his pals who joined him in the majority opinion in Kennedy versus Louisiana, they're going to be there for the rest of their lives, and there's nothing we can do about it. So the bottom line is, it may be that occasionally we would prefer a policy outcome. I'm not even arguing about the policy outcomes. It may be that occasionally we'd favor the policy outcomes that are favored by these judges when they behave this way. But that's like saying, Mussolini made the trains run on time. I mean, by accident, an unaccountable dictatorial authority will do something once in a while that you like, but that doesn't mean you want to live under an unaccountable dictatorial authority. So I don't even have time for this kind of an argument. Yeah, sure, anybody who's imposing his will on me may occasionally tell me to do something I like doing, but that doesn't mean that it's acceptable. It's not acceptable. And who are these people? In general, it's a small clique of people from a couple of law schools. And by the way, I don't know whether you know this, but most people listening, I'm sure, have not been to law school. I have. It doesn't involve any instruction in economics. It doesn't involve any instruction in morality. It doesn't involve any instruction in science. Being a lawyer doesn't mean you know a thing. And just because you've been to a famous law school and knew some politician, which resulted in your being on a prominent court, doesn't mean you're an authority to whom I should sign over power over my life. So I find this entire tendency in our government just appalling. I find it offensive. It's annoying. It's based on the assumption that these people are some greater order of beings, and they're not. Have you ever read any of Anthony Kennedy's opinions?
I've read some and some excerpts. Yeah,
he's a nitwit. He sounds, when he starts going on about the meaning of being and so on, he sounds like some guy who had too much pot in California in the '60s, and then he ended up on a federal court. It's just what reason is there that Anthony Kennedy should be able to overturn the seriously deliberated, intelligently made decisions of a state legislature? Now, it may be that he doesn't approve of them. Maybe you and I wouldn't approve of what the state legislature in question decided, but that doesn't mean we should get to veto it just because we don't like it. For one thing, I only live in one state. Why should I be vetoing anybody else's laws? And for another thing, nobody elected him to that position, and they always do this under the claim that the Constitution is doing it. It's not that we're doing it. The Constitution requires this. The Constitution requires that. So again, in Kennedy versus Louisiana, after more than 200 years under the U.S. Constitution, we realize that the Constitution says that raping a little kid is not a bad enough crime to merit capital punishment. Really? Really? You don't even have to be an advocate of capital punishment to think that's just appalling. So I can't name any particular policy decision they made that I think is wonderful and excuses this general tendency. I don't think there is one.
All right, well, we'll leave it there, and thank you so much for joining me and for being so generous with your time. If someone wants to learn more about the sorts of topics we've been discussing today, and if someone wants to follow your work in particular, what do you recommend they take a look at?
Well, they could take a look at my website, which is kevingutzman.com. They could follow me on Twitter at Kevin Gutzman. That's Gutzman. I'm also on Facebook.
Okay, great. Well, I want to remind everybody to go take a look at the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/incorporation-doctrine, and that's where you'll find all the websites and resources and books related to this episode. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/incorporation-doctrine is the place to go, the show notes page for this episode. And I very briefly want to mention, since I mentioned in the introduction that today's guest, Kevin Gutzman, is a faculty member at Liberty Classroom. If you want to sign up for Liberty Classroom, then I encourage you to do so either through the links available on today's show notes page or by going to wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty, wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty. That way you can get their great services and you can help support this show as well. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty for that. And I want to encourage everybody to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher so that you can get all the episodes and not miss any and help us out as well. And Kevin, thank you so much for joining me today to take a look at the 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine and, in general, the principle of decentralization. So thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.